Welcome to Approaches to Listening. I'm William Taylor, the host and author. Episode 5, Refining the Thinking Filters. It's all in your head. I've heard this phrase so many times in my musical career, and not just targeted towards me. I've focused a lot on the need for balance between thinking and feeling in this podcast. And as an academic musician, I've addressed a common problem we have of thinking too much and feeling too little. That being said, thinking well is one of my favorite things in the world, and I'm excited to share my thoughts about music and thinking today. I'll try to limit information I've shared in the past to focus on additional ideas that didn't fit in the purview of past episodes. In today's episode, I'll focus on the thinking filters, and while I can't totally isolate them from the feeling filters, I will focus on ideas that are largely unique to both the analytical and critical filters. Let me begin with a question. Is analysis necessary as a listener? If you want more than the initial feelings that music offers, then yes, it is. I wanted to start with that question because of the intense struggles I've seen in fellow musicians with both music theory and music history classes in their music programs. I remember being in an upper-level music history class with a singer-songwriter. Most of that course had only a tenuous connection to the music she loved, composed, and performed. Situations like that beg this question: is analysis necessary as a musician? I originally thought that the answer is no, but that's only an initial answer, and as such is incomplete. Until we've learned to analyze, we engage with music much more by feeling, but there comes a point where that's not enough, at least not in isolation. Feeling is nebulous, ethereal, and extremely variable, and without thinking to balance it, we aren't solidly anchored in either listening or performing. This leads me to one of my favorite roles of analysis, the naming process. One of my favorite examples that highlights the potential of names comes from West Side Story, when Tony learns the name of the woman he just fell in love with, Maria. After he learns the name, he can use it. He can sing his song about her and later find Maria by using her name. Naming takes something you know and makes it more real, more discernible, and analysis is key to that process. Now, analysis isn't just about naming. It's also about finding what's in a name. In music theory, we often use the words label or name in conjunction with the word function. Defining something's purpose and use is part of the naming process. Names and rules are linked, and both should support the other. For example, in the key of C major, we call the chord spelled F-A-C the subdominant, or 4 chord. The subdominant chord has a function, and has rules that affect both how it's spelled and how it relates to other chords. The chord spelled C-E-G has different relationships, a different function, and with those differences, a unique name. This allows us to label it, know its function, and use it properly. Without this system of names and rules, we can't analyze. Imagine baking a recipe, but names are excluded from the recipe. So the recipe heading says you're making a sweet, dense, brown treat that should be primarily flavored with a bitter brown powder and should be crunchy on the top, but chewy in the middle. We can deduce that's a brownie, but it's so much extra work. Without a name, you have to describe something as completely as you can, while the name can simply encapsulate all that. You could probably work out the proportions of fluffy white powder, bitter brown powder, and sweet white crystals, but once again it's terribly inconvenient and is subject to copious amounts of interpretation. Let's try to go the other route, though. You have the name of the ingredients, but don't know the rules for each ingredient. This is portrayed in Disney's Sleeping Beauty when the good fairy Fauna folds in 2 eggs, shells and all, to her cake, as well as using 3 different sized cups to measure the flour. She has a system, the recipe, but since she doesn't understand the rules about the ingredients, she cannot bake a cake. Only when both the names and rules come together within a system are they effective and ready for repeated use. With a name and the rules that govern it, you can make things do what you need them to do. Whether you're engaging with an object like flour or a person like Maria, knowing both the name and its governing rules is key to optimizing your relationship. The rules help you conceptualize the name, and then the name should encapsulate the rules. In music, the more we can identify the rules and name the elements that make up our music, the more control and understanding we can have in both our listening and performing. Now, I've heard the argument many times, the system is made up, or the Western model of music theory is made up. To which I'd respond, of course it is. But without a system, we have no framework for our analysis, and we can't unify in our thinking. We can't even talk about the same things unless we agree on our use of labels and names. You cannot analyze without systematized knowledge, and without analysis, we have no foundation to build off besides the nebulous realm of feeling. Now, there isn't one system of music to rule them all. Beethoven pushed the compositional norms in his day, as did Brahms, Debussy, and Stravinsky, and there are countless cultures with their own unique systems of music. The important thing is having a system that is supported by your thinking or by your analysis. Again, we tend to feel first in music, but our analysis can verify our feelings. It can make them discernible, and in so doing, anchor them. In academia, we do have a problem with overuse when it comes to the analytical filter, something I've discussed in my other episodes. To summarize past episodes, analysis is a thought-based, out-of-the-moment process. It's invaluable in gaining knowledge, but it's very quantifiable. And as such, you can restrict your musical experience by just holding on to that which is quantified and known. Here's an example that illustrates that point. I once heard a performance of the Liszt Piano Sonata, a piece I've analyzed and know quite well. As the work progressed, I noticed that I was right ahead of the music, probably 2 to 3 seconds ahead, thinking about function and surprise and form, but I was exclusively thinking instead of thinking about and feeling those things. So it was like the moment happened in my head in a little way, instead of my being with the pianist, audience, and actual sound the moment it occurred, which was my loss. Universities require measurable or quantifiable progress, so it's natural that many high-level musicians overuse this filter, but I believe it's worth investing time and energy into learning how to shift from one filter to another. And for academic musicians, that's especially true when shifting from the thinking filters to the feeling. That leads me to comment on one of the most significant changes in music that largely occurred within the past century when technology enabled musicians to record their works. This enabled both the spread of music and the ability to re-listen to a musical performance on demand. While recordings are commonplace today, this sparked a musical revolution where you can listen to the exact same performance as many times as you want. So how does analysis fare when re-listening to music? I'm reminded of a story about a cleaning lady who worked at my alma mater. Frequently, the cleaning crew would go to a local Burger King for lunch, and one lady in particular would always comment, pointing to a dirty corner, "Cobwebs still there." Reusing analysis can be like that story. Augmented sixth chord is still there. The counterpoint's still there, as is the melody. When re-listening and using the analytical filter, the best approaches I know are to look for something new to analyze or pair analysis with another filter, like experience. Generally, I think we can make better use of our time than just saying, "The cobweb's still there," when listening to great music. I also feel that there are missed opportunities within high-level musical analysis. I believe there are elements of music that aren't yet properly named and labeled, which explains why I had to create my 4 filters to describe in detail the scope of listening. But there's more than just that. Most notable is our lack of names that describe the ubiquitous but ethereal and ephemeral things that are everywhere in music. Most musicians I've talked to have had a transcendent experience with music and know exactly what I'm talking about when I describe the peak experiences music can offer. But what do we call those moments? What elements make them up? Individuals have phrases and words. I've obviously used a word I associate with Franz Liszt, transcendent. But analytical systems can't yet describe that space, zone, thing. And without a name that fits in our system, it's easy to leave that phenomenon out of our attitudes and actions. Surely naming that and finding how to measure it, finding the rules that govern it, is worthwhile. I have lots of thoughts about that unnameable thing that I won't go into now, save for this. I'm certain that listening is a key part of it. Continuing on, I believe that feeling characterizes our initial encounters with music, but analysis is our gateway to thinking, our gateway to building an anchoring foundation within music. Part of why that is because our critical filter is built entirely on the tools we gain through analysis, which leads us to part 2, cultivating critique. There are 3 questions I'd like to address in this section. When do we critique? How do we critique? And why do we critique? First off, an overview of critique from my previous episode's material. Critique is extremely focused on the future. There are very few applications where it is optimal in the present. Critique almost always requires you to pause whatever you're engaging with. Critique is used when you formulate or employ a standard or form of evaluation, or in academic terms, a rubric. This rubric tells you whether something is acceptable or wanted, and can be used to help you decide what you want more of, which improves your chances of getting more of that thing. Question 1. How do you critique? The first step is straightforward. Make a rubric. The more compact and clear your rubric, the better. Most of us have an unspoken rubric, but it's not a bad idea to detail in writing what you want from the music you engage with. This draws heavily on analysis. You'll need words, names, and rules to make a good rubric, and articulating something resembling a comprehensive rubric is extremely demanding. Now, what about a rubric entirely based in feeling? I've encountered many friends who have such a rubric, and they become very offended when I ask them to defend their rubric with this question: what makes the music you like good? There's a ton of variations on that question that can round out your rubric, but at the heart of that question is this point: feeling alone won't craft a good, sustainable rubric. Once your rubric is completed, you can compare the rubric to the things you're engaging with, whether that's a performance or a performer or a genre as a whole. At this point, you're looking for things that are good and things that are bad, or looking for things that are right or wrong, and these are based on criteria that you have selected based on your analysis. Now, there is the argument that good and bad are totally subjective in music, but few, if any, musicians actually practice that belief, which speaks to the importance of critique. Second question, when do you critique? You critique in times or situations of surplus. Beggars can't be choosers, but when you're opening Spotify, YouTube, or Apple Music, critique most definitely is merited. Imagine walking into a piano store. You have your budget and your criteria for a new piano. Say you want a baby grand with a white finish and a bright tone. So you narrow it down to the 3 to 4 options within the store and choose whichever piano best fits your criteria from that selection. If they only had one white baby grand, there's less space and need for critique. Today we have more options than we've ever had when it comes to choosing what music we listen to or choosing what piano we'll buy. A single Google search provides a ridiculous scope of options. This surplus increases the need for thoughtful critique. Secondly, another place for critique is during any form of test. Juries, exams, auditions, interviews, all of these require the use of the critical filter. These events also indicate an ending, an end to a semester's lessons, or an end to a section of a course, or the completion of an audition process. Critique is appropriately used when things end. I remember checking my grades incessantly as an undergraduate. Even though I had completed all my work and done everything that I could do, the course didn't end till I was given my grade, till I was fully critiqued for my work in the class. Another place and time for critique is after a memorable experience, whether it's poor or good. Critique helps you find out why it was great or find out why it was lame. It's important to remember this. Critique extends the experience, for good and for bad. I once attended a concert of a group I listened to all the time. I was so excited to be there live and get the full experience. The concert started, and I made it about 10 seconds into the concert before my expectations were first disappointed. And sadly, it didn't stop there. That concert had lots of high points, but my overall experience was one of disappointment. As of today, I haven't let go of that experience, and I've continued to critique it now years after the fact. The consequence of that is that my experience has been prolonged, albeit in a lesser way. However, my critique has spurred my research and artistic activity, which seems a fair trade for prolonging my disappointment with that 75 minutes of my life. Which leads us to why we critique. There are a million wrong reasons to critique, but critique is not inherently wrong. It's just very easy to critique the wrong way or for the wrong reason. I believe the primary reason we should critique is to make sure we're where we want to be and are getting what we want. Be careful when solely using someone else's rubric. Reviews and ratings are often a great starting point to begin or complement your critique, but they shouldn't be the be-all and end-all. That's simply a responsibility you shouldn't take off of your own shoulders. I detail this idea in other episodes, but remember, there are many entities that would love to tell you what's best and what's not. Because of that, this is something you should personally invest in. Now here's an example of a wrong way to conduct critique. Say a fellow pianist is performing on a studio recital, and they're my competition, so to speak. So I watch them like a hawk and listen for anything they do wrong. And of course, all of this is in my pursuit of being number one. Now, I don't want to argue this point from a moral view, but more from a practical, music-based view. In that light, why is this wrong? Because you could either focus on connecting with the music or engage in mental, out-of-the-moment work to elevate your standing and boost your ego. Critique takes you out of the moment, meaning that you can't fully engage with the music while critiquing. You can be fully engaged, but if you're out of the time that makes up the sound in time that is music, then you can't fully be in the music. It's better to practice proper listening and let that guide your upward progression. Here's a closer approach to optimal listening while critiquing. Focus first on fully engaging with the music. And when some aspect of the performance distracts you or takes you out of the music, make a mental note of that for critique, but re-engage with the music as soon as you can, as the music should be the primary reason you're at a musical performance. Now, some mistakes are so egregious that they make reconnecting with the music nigh impossible. Critically speaking, that's an important thing to take note of. But until the moment becomes so bad that you'd rather not be in it, it's best to continue searching for the moment. There are many right ways to listen to music, but at the heart of each of those ways is a priority to connect with the music. If that's not the case, then you're engaging in an activity that is extra musical. I don't think there's anything wrong with the choice of focusing on extra musical features, but I do believe that connection to purely musical ideas requires the most developed listening skills, and as such offers the greatest benefits that listening holds. But we'll dive more into that idea in episode 7. Now, what about re-listening with the critical filter? Like the analytical filter, I feel that reuse without a specific purpose is largely ineffective, especially if the critique hasn't yielded the results you want in the past. For example, I love critiquing artists who deliver immaculate performances. It's amazing to hold up my rubric and have them check every box. But this is usually just an initial thing. After they've checked every box, I have no inhibitions to surrendering myself to the music and their performance. On a similar note, the more I develop as a listener, the more I can find lacking in a performance, which leaves me with the option to critique more harshly. Here's an example of how that can be overutilized. Renee Fleming, accompanied by the Prague Symphony Orchestra, has my favorite recording of Morgan by Richard Strauss. But there's a couple elements of that performance that I've never been sold on. The violin soloist's vibrato is too regular for me in the opening, and at the very end of the vocal solo, the harp arrives on the last note just before the vocalist. These are extremely picky critiques, but I love Renee Fleming's performance so much that I return to this recording again and again. I can't unhear these critiques, and my opinion hasn't changed that I think the performance would be better if they were different. So what do I do in my listening in this scenario? I focus on something else by listening for the bigger picture. The bigger picture is, of course, made up of individual elements, but failing to see the masterful performance for the vibrato is probably more my fault than the violinist's. Another answer is simply to use another filter. But if our critical filter is restricting our relationship with music, then it surely needs some refining. In this case, I look at the most important criteria on my rubric, and if those are met, I let them overpower those small elements that I would tweak. As I've repeatedly done this with different genres, works, and artists, I've gained a clearer picture of what should be the most important criteria on my listening rubric. I've also created a larger library of rubrics, each one suited to my needs and wants, but each one giving the genre its due. Once again, it's very fun for me to compare and contrast these rubrics and see what elements matter most to me across all music. It's an activity that I'd highly recommend to any musician. Positive reuse of the critical filter can be very rewarding and can help you craft the most demanding and satisfying rubric you could imagine. But moderation in all things is needed, which is a lesson that I learned as a sophomore. I tried to learn a very demanding work by Debussy as a teen, a piece that I would listen to every day. I would try to mimic what I heard, but I had nowhere near the skills I needed to do that, so I stagnated in my progress. Eventually, my teacher told me I needed to stop listening to the work. It would awe me in such an intense way that I couldn't settle for anything less, and struggled to conceive of anything less in my upcoming performance. But practicing a piece each day for a year and never getting close to your performance goal is a recipe for disaster, especially when you spend time each day reiterating to yourself that your performance doesn't match up with your favorite recording. I found that all filters are best used, critique included, when they help you move forward and enjoy the music you have today. That, of course, requires us to tie together the feeling and thinking filters, but the feeling filters will need to wait till next week's episode. Thank you for listening. If you'd like to support me or see more of my work, please visit my Patreon page or submit your email to my newsletter. The links will be in the show notes.